much indeed for coming along for this lunchtime seminar. It's our Institute for Research, Social Sciences and Inter-Institute Peace and Conflict Cluster Seminar Series. It's not easy to say. My name's Ruth Fee. I'm Head of School of Criminology, Politics and Social Policy at the University of Ulster. And today, for those of you who don't know him, and I'm sure there's not a sinner in the room who doesn't know Duncan, Duncan is going to be giving us a talk today on really a range of historical developments in Northern Ireland in terms of community relations, in its scale, scope and content and participation. And we're going to examine the impact and influence of community relations work on change in Northern Ireland. We're also going to look at the practical relevance of community relations and reconciliation in a post-devolution context. Of course, Duncan had been Chief Executive of CRC for a period of just over 9 years and has recently rejoined us at Ulster as a core member of our politics team. And also, and this is a very important point, as Director of Community Engagement of the University, and he's spearheading the developments in terms of community relations as part of our greater Belfast development. I want to keep today quite informal, so Duncan's going to go through his presentation, but please, if you have any questions, just direct them through Duncan, and hopefully this will be a really lively and engaging debate.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you all very much for coming. As I say, the Dalai Lama said to the Pope, it's a rough-looking crowd. The issue of community relations in Northern Ireland is not exactly new, and it's not exactly uncontroversial, so I hope, and this is in the spirit of it, that what I've got to say today stimulates a lively conversation about what I think has been a really important and significant difference in the way that some of the conflict and post-conflict questions have been approached here compared to in other places. Obviously, I have my interests in this, and part of this work derives out of reflective work that I did at the end of the Community Relations, at my time in the Community Relations Council, around exactly what this begins to look like. And part of the conversation goes back to a piece of research that I did with Karen Eben and Darren Wilson in 1997, well, it was published in 1997, and which as part of it, in a purely anecdotal way, we asked people what they thought community relations was, and the range of answers was itself illuminating. At one level we got it's a disco run by the RUC. On another level we got it's an ill-defined plot to rumble unionists into a united Ireland against their will. At another level we got it's part of counterinsurgency strategy. At another level, and possibly the most damaging of all, in practical terms we got it's cucumber sandwiches. Cucumber sandwiches in policy. So you're all eating sandwiches, so there's not too much cucumber in them. But the bottom line of it is that at some level or other, everybody appears to have a view about it, but the undefined nature of it and the question of what it actually turns out to be is of itself interesting. I have far too many slides and far too much to say, so part of the issue for me today is to try to move through this quickly. What I do want to say is that at the end of this is obviously an open conversation, and I hope that it does stimulate a full debate. The first, as you can see, there's a whole load of things I want to talk about here. One of which is I want to present you what I understand to be a political analysis of some of the issues that we have to deal with, which is on itself automatically an assertion which you may wish to challenge. The rest of it really goes through some of where I think this notion came from, what we meant by community relations, how it evolved, how it expanded, who paid for it, what the attempt to try to make it into a mainstream activity looked like, whether there was going to be systemic change, and then some more empirical data around what it actually turns out to look like when you start to look at what was funded on the ground. And then the question of successes and failures and where the impact is going to be as we go forward. So that gives you some overview of where I want to go with this. The first thing I want to suggest to you is that you can't understand Northern Ireland without some understanding of the historical backdrop which created... Oh, sorry. What happened there? Essentially, the imperial legacy of history is that of one of territorial expansion, whereby political power systems are established on top of populace. They become the organising state principle. And essentially the movement since the French Revolution has been towards the notion of self-determination, that liberty is entirely tied up with self-determination, the democratic movement, which is meant to be my diagram on the second side, which you simply shift the notion of where legitimacy and power exists. The crisis in Europe occurs in about the 1920s, just after the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson, a good Ulster Scot by background, comes over to Europe and says that the principle of the peace process in Europe should be the establishment of self-determination as the founding principle of states, which, as far as an American is concerned, is a movement from tyranny to liberty. It's a simple movement from one triangle to the other. The difficulty of the ragged edge of empire, and the Habsburg Empire in particular, but right across all of them, the Ottoman Empire possibly more, and the German Empire too, is that the nature of this expansion creates all sorts of complex interactions with populations. And when they attempt to create popular legitimacy around territory, who owns this place, the really difficult places, of course, are those in the square box at the bottom, which is, what do you do if part of your population identifies one way, and the other part of the population identifies the other way, and there is no simple territorial mechanism to separate and segregate those people into people who all feel that they got what they wanted, with the potential that you have to choose. And that choice will be determined largely by the constellations of political power. In the courts of the Habsburg Empire, if you're German, you're not going to do too well. If you're Hungarian, you're not going to do too well. If you're Muslim, you're not going to do too well in Turkey. If you're Serb, if you're Czech, if you're Polish, you may expect that there'll be some change here. But that the interfaces in those empires work that way. But that in the British Empire, effectively, because Britain was not being told what to do in the context of a movement for national self-determination on the island of Ireland, the consequence was that the zone in which that question was most difficult to resolve, where do we belong, what becomes Northern Ireland, the sixth county element of the north of Ireland, is separated and remains within the United Kingdom. But I want to suggest to you that two things happened at once. Both partition and devolution create something which I'm not sure whether it was intentional, but I am absolutely sure that it had massive consequences, which was that while it juridically separated Ireland into parts, it also separated Northern Ireland quite distinctively and distinctly from the rest of the United Kingdom, and effectively created a kind of hermetically sealed zone, which is, at one level, contains the worst of the ongoing interface between relationships between British and Irish people, people identifying as that and the consequence of empire, but also abandons them to their fate. That effectively everybody else moves away from it simultaneously as it's contained. And that one way to understand Northern Ireland as an entity, and I'm using the term entirely juridically rather than saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, is to say that it contains within it the crisis of self-determination, the crisis of legitimacy, which is effectively what everybody tries to avoid elsewhere. But it does so within a framework of being both contained and abandoned. The consequence of that is that what was an all-island issue, the question of home rule in Ireland and the future of the empire, turns into a contained issue. If you want to know my analysis of this further, I suspect that once it explodes and comes back onto the agenda of British-Irish affairs more broadly in 1969-70, the most sustained thrust of active intervention is to contain it again, both politically and actually militarily and security-wise, because if you look at the data on who was actually killed in Northern Ireland, especially once the immediate impulse around interment and Bloody Sunday and the consequences of that start to roll through. So what for 1975? Marie Smith's work tells us that 95% of the people who die are identifiable in 3 categories actually only. One is living in poor districts of Belfast, particularly within reach of an actual physical dividing wall, but actually in North and West Belfast overwhelmingly. The second element is in a zone of rural contest which runs roughly from Macrofelt in the north, past down the east side of the Lough Neagh, through Dungannon, Craigavon to Armagh. So there's a kind of contested zone and around the border. And then the third category of people is in the security forces directly, who were specifically put into, if you like, conflict, but into direct interface with the issues that were emerging. So the rest of Northern Ireland was effectively kept out of that. And actually, as we recover from conflict, that has proved to be an enormous problem, or a very important issue, which is that those areas which have been at the heart, if you like, of the activity around conflict and its containment in the interfaces, in the contested rural zones, find themselves in many ways still living with huge legacy of the tale of what that meant for them in their personal life, and that the rest of the community effectively learned under direct rule that don't get involved. And so you have a huge problem of civic engagement in what the future looks like, because the broad swathe of society's common sense learned experience now is that this is all about going backwards. And so you have at one level, a community which is deeply historicised by this event, and another community whose learned experience is participate in the economy and have nothing to do whatsoever with politics. And so that it's at different levels and different debates, very impossible to have that conversation across that divide, quite apart from across the sectarian divide. So, and in many ways, the deal is, if you keep me in the middle classes safe, then I'm not going to ask what you're doing in the gap. That's the deal. So, effectively the problem with this is that if you have an interface in which the state is the choice of some and not of others, that effectively, for one part of the population, that is that you have one group of people who identify and one group of people who do not identify. The critical issue that needs to come out of this, though, is that what it does is also create a crucial issue, obviously, of political equality, because the sense of identification of the state is pretty absolute and polarised. But the economic issues and the social issues are also interfaced with this, again, in a very complicated manner. This is not a case simply of an occupied population by an alien state. Neither is it a case of a settlement with a few remaining people still objecting to the settlement, which is the case of the United States. It is actually something in between, in which, if you want to take an extremely schematic view of this, the further down you go in the social pyramid, the higher the percentage of people who are non-identifiers, Catholics, nationalists effectively, and the further up you go, the higher the percentage of Protestants. But it is not possible to make a simple equality argument based on transfer of resources from one community to the other. And so the antagonistic principle, which is we are antagonists across this line here, doesn't accord with the issue of equality. What we know, and we can discuss about who's responsible for it, but what we definitely know is that in political terms this has been the preeminent line. That the equality line about the distribution from one to the other has never effectively established itself. What it also means is that discussions about equality always get tied up with discussions about antagonism in a complex way, in which issues which are about equality on one side are heard as attacks on antagonism in this way, or at least translated into that, or the other way around. Issues which are about defence of the community are understood as a further wish to continue with discrimination. So that antagonism and equality, the debates around those things, good relations if you like, and equality constantly end up as questions of priority, as opposed to the difficult and complicated question about how you move from that kind of a circumstance to something which delivers both. But it's not clear to me, just to be really clear about this, either that you can resolve it by niceness and not dealing with the equality issues, or the other question, which is that you can resolve it by transferring resources without triggering antagonistic consequences. And unless we get on top of this conversation, we won't get anywhere, to be honest. And so the debate, whatever it's framed as an issue of transfer of resources plus some kind of security in the future where the transfer leads, is, for my money, not doable without doing the two at once. It requires you to choreograph that. You can't do them once. If they're not do one and you'll get the other, you definitely won't. And that's predictable. Just to say that some of the consequences, and I really won't talk about this too long, because this is a lot of formative stuff, is I think you can think of Northern Ireland as a whole as an interface of British and Irish relationships, in which what we call the interface is but a concentrated. It is that the entire community operates within a framework of them and us type of thinking, and you have a structural interface between two historic attempts to create legitimacy. Number two, that distilled antagonism as a principle. Antagonism, I think, is a more useful idea than either sectarianism or any of these other things, because it talks about what this is a competitive relationship of hostility. We exist in what we believe to be a competitive relationship of hostility. That it's around religion or politics or economics is actually secondary. What is important is that all of those, you can fight for all of those reasons for the same hostility. And what is repetitive is this sense that you are in a relationship which is them and us, in which it's extremely clear to you that the political imperative to act as you do is to do with the causative impact of what somebody did on you. So they are always the cause. The fundamental flaw lies outside of yourself. Equality, inequality and discrimination, I said to you, I'll go back on that one just to say that it strikes me that from this side, equality, inequality and discrimination are obvious. And it doesn't even work as language because essentially it's exclusion. But from here, it doesn't look like it at all. The question of equality and inequality and discrimination applies here in a different type of a way. And so therefore it's a language which is absolutely real and absolutely justified, but extremely difficult to create any common frameworks around. The asymmetric and compromised state, that the state is not a point of cohesion. That's like to state the obvious. But it is instead an asymmetric state in relation to its citizens. So the concept of equal citizenship is constantly short-circuited by the fact that the state itself is not itself equal. So you have a problem of an asymmetric and compromised state. It is contained and festering most of the time. In other words, you keep the lid on this because you can't resolve it, but silence is not always golden. Actually, at every micro level, offence and deliberate exclusion and choices which favour one over another and acts which are understood on one side as normal and defensive on another side absolutely offensive are constantly causing the thing to fester. And the escalation to violence, that effectively the justification that there is no alternative but to actually grab to arms has been made effectively, historically in Ireland regularly, but in the last 40 years, 25 years, obviously as a systematic argument. The consequence, I suppose, is just a diagrammatic representation of that. If the notion of the democratic Western state, albeit idealistic, is as a state which commonly binds people in some kind of civic equality in their diversity, that's the notion of the United States, then Northern Ireland, albeit with a series of declarations that it was the same, actually looked like this, in which the critical issue was not your individuality, but your fundamental relationship to the state, loyalism or resistance. And I've used those terms in terms of your approach rather than in terms of any particular group. That is this my state or not my state? Am I in it or am I not? Vanilla in search of a state. But effectively, that the problem with this is, theoretically the only alternative is to reverse it. Unless you can actually, you can put a green triangle there and reverse it. But you still have a difficulty, particularly where you have to suppress, unless you can find something else. So that's the structure that underpins the emergence of community relations here, and why language, which makes sense over here about creating community relations, comes into here and is automatically part of that debate, inevitably. Okay, so sectarianism. What is called sectarianism? And this stuff about the golf is fascinating last week to me, because, you know, all of a sudden somebody says something which everybody knows, which is that it's in the middle classes, and all of a sudden that is the thing you're not allowed to say, because that would break the stability. And also because it's taken at an entirely superficial level, it means, did somebody in here say something to you? An attitude or an approach, as opposed to what I'm trying to present here to you, which is sectarianism is a structure. It is a word to describe an antagonism, in which, in some senses, we have born into and maintained and repeated, possibly because we didn't feel there was much choice, but nevertheless repeated. So it is a legacy in the sense that it is the filter through which we understand history and our identity. More or less, that's not to say it's equal and everywhere the same, but it is, and some people resist that enormously because they don't want to be tied into that reality. But the next point is it's a structure. In other words, even if you resist it at an identity level, you may be tied into it at a structural level, because you have to access services through this as well. And you have to access things from the very beginning through this. So it is a structure. It is built into how you decide what is a reasonable or not a reasonable institution. And it is not a choice in that sense that we construct our identity by some kind of act of will. We engage with this, and you have to make a choice. And you may make interesting choices, but nevertheless you'll find yourself that overwhelmingly there's a structural direction which is pushing you down one way or the other, which defines all sorts of things. It's a behaviour. In other words, what it starts to be, because it's associated with fear and it's associated with hostility and antagonism, and the sense that you will not be accepted on an equal basis. Not a sense, actually, an experience possibly. The bottom line here is that it is massively instituted in micro-behaviour. In trying to sell this to people, you have to talk about this to people, you have to, look, this is about your choice not to walk up that street because, frankly, nothing to do with you or your intention towards others is, I didn't know I was a Jew till they came to take me away. It's that kind of behaviour. It is, you don't walk up, you don't wear, you don't move, you don't, so choices. I mean, the one I was thinking about today in the light of Gertwood is, while Protestants lived in Torrance, funny enough, no Catholics ever applied to go there. Meanwhile, no Protestants wanted them in and spent ages trying to push them away. When they got moved out, funny enough, it wasn't. It was a choice place. It's nothing to do with location. It has absolutely everything to do with whether you have to mix with people. And choice is absolutely determined by, co-determined with fear. And the notion that you can detach those things out from one another. So the language of free choice in this society has to be filtered through the reality of antagonism at every time. So it is a behavioural thing which happens all the time. You blame the person who goes to the Celtic top of the Rangers area, or the other way around, because they should have known that. But behaviour should be auto behaviour. Attitude, it also, the notion that this can be distilled into attitudes. In other words, at the golf course he said this. You know something, they probably did at the point when they didn't know they were doing it. The point of offence is these are way, way down the pipe. And it absolutely affects then all the rest of this too, and your circular arguments. But the point I'm trying to make here is community relations is not about niceness. It has to start talking about how you engage with behaviour and what behaviours are your indicators that mean you know that something has changed. It has to talk about structures. It has to talk about, are we simply in perpetuating structures where we try to catch it afterwards? How are we going to deal with that? And it has to talk about how we engage with the past in terms of whether we want to continue with that, simply repeating it, or whether we're interested in actually revisiting it and understanding it as a rat trap. That's the question. And that remains for me a critical question. So, enough. Community relations, to be honest with you, what does it mean? First of all, it emerged in Great Britain as a term in the 1960s, largely associated with the arrival of new immigrant communities into British cities. And it was, if you like, a social democratic Labour Party attempt to try to do something about this. I suppose the Labour Party saw its vote, its working class vote, reacting sharply against what they saw was job competition. They also saw, and cultural uncertainty, they also saw their own principles in terms of people moving in and equality being challenged. So it came there. So certainly there is an acknowledgement there's a problem here. It's not actually running away. It was defined in the first instance against something rather than for what it was for. It's defined against violence. It is part of, however, in my view, a broader civil rights, American meaning, stroke European post-Holocaust analysis, which is that the treatment of minorities matters and has serious consequences moving on, and is beyond simply a fact of government and moral imperative. It is tied up with rights, absolutely tied up with the rights of individuals. And it is also a question of trying to extend the notion of participation to people who are seen to be excluded. So it has something to do with community development. And at some level or other, and this is the complexity, it's not international, it's an international. It's between nations, in other words, resistance to the logic of national identity, which actually in Europe, to be honest, comes to its crisis in Nazism. Because the question is, what is the limit that can be used? I mean, it's Parnell's question on the statute, no man has the right to set the limit of a nation. Actually, after Hitler, you can't go there. You have to set the limit of the nation, and you have to define what it is. And in international law, in Nuremberg, it becomes human rights. Actually, that's the limit of a nation. That's it. You can't go past that. But it is unbelievably fragile, to be honest with you, as an entity. But at the same time, let's be very clear what other people thought it was. A Trojan horse, the threat to the integrity of the national cause. We don't want to go anywhere near it. It was the politics of the armchair, the concern of those who are distant from the consequences. It's not serious. It's all about niceness in the room. It's the descent into niceness and refusal of the necessity of justice rather than deal with the issues. Let's deal with the superficial. And a defence of vested interest by partisans. In other words, underlying it all, there is a defence. That critique runs through the whole thing from start to finish. In Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland, you have to say it all, this didn't occur in an armchair. It emerges in Northern Ireland directly connected to the arrival of a Labour government, the British government and its troops in Ireland in 1969, in August 1969. And as part of this connection to community universities in Great Britain, where they've already started to introduce it as part of their policy in Birmingham and Manchester and London. And it tries to tie into this civil rights non-violent element, which is, so there is a recognition there is a problem in Northern Ireland. It's not a non-recognition, and it has to do with the exclusion of certain people. That's true. But at the same time, it's forced on a unionist government. They have to take on a ministry of community relations, most of whom regard it, both the ministry and the people who it's dealing with, as fraternising with the enemy. Why the hell are we appeasing these people who are enslaved in the state, or why the hell are we dealing with this state which is unreformable? So community relations becomes tied up with what exactly is this? Is it a mechanism to absolve the state of its responsibilities, or is it a mechanism to actually force the state to capitulate to its enemies? And it depends if you find both. They did establish an independent commission, actually, which took a very radically different view, and essentially, and its long legacy was to go for the notion of participation, that in the most marginal communities you had to create partners for people to engage in serious social and economic discussion as well as politics. And so the commission, what it did was establish community development workers who went around creating community development opportunities in all over Northern Ireland. That's what it did. Mostly in poor Catholic districts where it was felt that there was the greatest gap between the state and the community that was there. But it was based on a vision of participative democracy and inclusion. It had nothing to say about the flag over Northern Ireland, and effectively in the 1972-74 crisis, it got completely marginalised, except as a witness to what was going on. And if you read the publications of the Commission, particularly their discussion of segregation in housing and what was happening in terms of the movements in housing, they're unbelievably modern. And their analysis of what is going on is as valid today as in Dirtwood as it is there. It's very, very useful 1973-74 stuff. I'm not going into it. Are you all alive still? Can I have to say, by 1974, they abolished the whole thing by mutual consent. Politicians absolutely hated it because they thought of it as non-political and not under their control. And so they got rid of it. The first act, the only actual act of the 1974 Power Sharing Executive was to abolish the Community Relations Commission, because we're doing it. We're doing it now. And the consequence then was that 5 months later nothing was done, and you can read the triumph in the Hansard of the unionist politicians. It's great, thank God, get rid of that nonsense. We don't want any of that talking to people who are in. So it was effectively abolished by consensus. I have to say, part of the issue around community relations is the core uncertainty about what it was actually about. And what is interesting over the next period is that it evolves around a set of core ideas. First of all, this question of inclusion and dialogue, it is about alternatives to violence. There's no doubt whatsoever. The reconciliation agenda, which is kind of narrower at this point, is essentially saying once you recognise the other person as a human being, what are you going to do about it? What is it you owe within a human rights and equality and a community relations framework to that reality? And that's where it starts. Anti-sectarianism, there are some who believe you simply have to get contact together, and that there's a strand which is this is not good enough, so you get a lot of this kind of children's holiday schemes and so on where people outside are contact. That becomes an important element. Integration is a theme emerging particularly around education in the 1980s, that we should be in shared institutions, and the beginning of that. The really critical political moment, though, I have to say, I believe, is the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which established effectively intergovernmental consensus around the future of sharing in Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, and for the first time talked about reconciliation as a goal of government. Reconciliation became a goal of government. It also established by international treaty the International Fund for Ireland, which was the first attempt to create a framework, interestingly funded from abroad, to actually generate support for this at a treaty level. And beyond that, it was mostly about economic regeneration, regenerating people's state and society in a society which had, at this stage, disintegrated in many ways economically and socially and politically. But they did not have any partners. There were no partners. The consequences of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in the short run were the alienation of unionism and the continued alienation of republicanism. It did not, in the first instance, create any partners. And so, what you start to get, coming out of the human rights fraternity, the report which generates the Community Relations Council and the Community Relations Unit in the government comes out of SACR, the Standing Advisory Commission on Human Rights, in which it is absolutely clear that the question is, after rights, what do we do? And that the real weakness in this society is a social capital, modern language, but a social capital deficit across any dialogue and debate going on, and that it has to be fostered. That it won't happen by itself under pressure and violence. You have to foster this. And when we come to measuring the impact of community relations, one of the things that's extremely important to put in your mind here is that before you start talking about what community relations achieves in relation to external matters, the first assertion of the SACR report is that without protected development, this won't happen at all. That the pressure of antagonism are simply so deep. It's not about having to persuade anybody else. The actual achievement of doing this is like putting a greenhouse around a fragile plant in the middle of a cold wind. But you can't do it, otherwise the cold wind will kill your plants. That's the fact. So you have to greenhouse this. The SACR report, written by Hugh Fraser, Margaret Stuff, effectively says we need to do something more infrastructurally around this. It's very clear it's not alternative to rights. It's not alternative to equality. It's actually assumed that these are going to happen alongside it. That there's going to be a review of the Fair Employment Agency at that stage into the Fair Employment Commission, and that's going to be serious and do something about something. That it's participative. It's not about top-down, it is about trying to get stuff off the ground. But it is, I have to say, now very clear that what community relations means is much, much more clearly aligned with the conditions under which dialogue can be fostered with a view to creating some kind of inclusive peace. There is no doubt whatsoever that's what's happening. And the consequence in the late 80s is a revival of the whole infrastructure again. Central Community Relations Unit in Government, the Community Relations Council, the Department of Education's programmes, the Cultural Traditions Group, which was largely a lot of academics in Queen's and University of Ulster, meeting together to discuss things like the variety of Britishness and the varieties of Irishness. That's what they did, to try to say, you know, there's plural ways of looking at this, these are not simple things, all fostered by government money in academia. There's a small number of reconciliation organisations, and there are a small number of community development. Essentially though, and this is a language which we got out of work we did with business people, is that up to that point, the primary focus of British and actually Irish, but British policy in Northern Ireland was essentially adaptive. In other words, how do we keep life going while adapting to the underpinning circumstances? And the answer to that effectively begins to look like containment and walls, and trying to create some, eventually throwing MBW and all these kind of things, regeneration around at community level out. That's what that looks like. What community relations is starting to do is move into something else, which is how do you learn to do what you don't know how to do? How do you actually learn to do what is theoretically impossible, which is that people who believe they have good grounds to be enemies with each other begin to meet and also to discuss the key issues which have to be discussed. Good relations is still coming out of a notion which isn't about harmony. In fact, it's moving towards something which says, under what conditions can we discuss the seriously disharmonic in this society to create answers which don't necessarily go back down the antagonistic route. And actually this language of good relations is catastrophic, because most people think immediately that it is about instant harmony. It's some kind of Buddhist New Age hum around which we all, it's nothing to do with that. It is about creating the social and political conditions under which, finally, the issues of antagonism and inequality can be addressed within certain frameworks. Okay? The 1990 as a way, paradoxically, to define more clearly what you mean by community relations and what this intervention is going to look like. Meredith Stockton came up with this called a typology of community relations work. This is what she said it was, and I've got it down to 4, but she had about 8. Essentially, it's inter-community meeting and dialogue. That's what we're going to foster, but it doesn't happen here. And that's under mutual understanding work, conflict resolution work, and inter-church work. The church is seen to be of central importance to this because you can deal with it. Big issues about what you do with people. This is just coming off the back of the ACE discussion and around political vetting, I have to say. And so who's in this conversation is blurred. Okay? But that's where it goes first. Second, political engagement. So it's mostly a little bit of think tank work, political office work, justice and right work. One of the first groups to get a grant from the Community Relations Council is the Committee for the Administration of Justice. It's where the link goes, and the Law Centre, actually. These are the kind of groups gathering. Creating opportunities to explore tolerance, accommodation and pluralism, very much coming from this academic side, that the goal is not reconciliation, the goal is to create tolerance and pluralism. Huge amount of emphasis on local history, on discussions and of trying to create frameworks within which people would make discussions. Developing specific community action programs to counter the extreme excesses of sectarianism and violence, particularly in the workplace. Trade unions developed anti-intimidation units very much as their priority, where literally individuals went in and essentially stood largely at times between bullets and people. But it was an interesting piece of individual work and anti-intimidation work, where they sought to encourage the development of anti-intimidation in the workplace. But that's what Mary said it was when she started. And essentially, you have to be very clear, 95% of CRC grants in the first 3 years were for under £3,500. This was small grant activity. This was seed fund something. Nobody ever thought it was the answer, but people thought we have to get community involvement in discussions around this topic. And from 1990 to 1993, that's what it looks like. And those are the kind of people who do it. With all sorts of, partly because they were the only people who were willing to do it. Actually wanted to do it, or were in some ways interested in it, because there was local grant. Church-related groups, very high proportion. Social justice and trade union-related organisations. Reconciliation groups. Self-consciously groups working for Reconciled Society, from whom there were 3 or 4 identifiable groups. Local community development, particularly all over the place, doing small additional projects. These are just examples there from Bellacood, Portaferry, East Belfast, the Maydown. cultural traditions organisations, actually quite a lot on the Irish language side, but more on the official Irish language side, probably, if we're honest about it. But there was quite a lot in there, as well as these kind of Ulster Historical Society things, which are more on the unionist side of it, and thematic events. All of this has a number of issues, which the most important of which is to say is, within a framework of what could be done, this is what occurred. Within a framework of what is the problem, this now looks like this is what we mean by community relations work, and still characterises what most people think a cucumber sandwich is the community relations work is about. 1990 is that most people's idea of what they're talking about is still characterised by this small group activity of people having wee meetings in wee rooms. And what is interesting, what I suppose the big theme of this is, how do you read across that instinct against the fact that you know that what you're dealing with is legacy, structural, behavioural and attitudinal, and that you have to get at it at every level. 2 ceasefires in the peace process. In the CRC core funding comes on stream at the same time as ceasefires. So you start to say we're going to give long-term support to organisations and groups for the very first time in 1994. It's around the same time as the Downstream Declaration. It's all part of the same push. It's all part of the same push to see what can be done on the ground, the ceasefires. Jacques Delors then comes along in the peace process and introduces the most massive intervention of finance into the issue of peace building that probably has ever been conceived of in the continent of Europe per head. And he says, the aim of the special programme is to the European Union solidarity with the people of Northern Ireland in their search for peace and reconciliation. So now, this has been raised to a political imperative. This is now political doctrine. We should seize the new opportunities for action in Northern Ireland and address the additional needs arising out of the peace process. This must be done now to convince those on the ground that the peace process can yield real dividends to their lives. So the purpose of the peace programme is now extending past the notion of sheer getting people to talk together to engaging everybody in a wider social development. And it triggers the same kind of a movement. I've got the anonymous donor here because the anonymous donor is representative. He's in the room. But the bottom line was these were huge funders. But the key thing that you need to notice about this is this was massively supported now internationally. All of the real trade for this money did not come from internal the British government. The really big push came from the international framework. So this is a very long paragraph, but I did a piece of work with Derek here and Karen Abel, 97, and we wrote this. In general, community relations is seen as a good thing, which is other people's responsibility to put into practice. The practice of treating equity, diversity and interdependence as issues to be dealt with by the weakest groups in society, community groups, children and theoretical policy, extends from the civil service downwards. The primary task of public policy and central institutions should be to widen the responsibility for responding to challenges of division to the major institutions, acknowledging the experience of the community sector in pioneering what forms of work that do exist. Equity, diversity and interdependence should not be left to children, youth and vulnerable community groups to implement. There is very little evidence that either the public or private sector of the economy has developed a systematic response to living with division, regarding it as at best an irrelevance and worse something to be ignored for as long as possible. So we have a public system which at no level has developed anything other than adaptation to this crisis, and where effectively the learning is overwhelmingly concentrated in the activities of volunteers and people trying to do things. Many organisations still do not see why or how they could contribute to a more stable, diverse and equitable society. Arguments to business need to be made on the basis of interests, such as improving the quality of service, reducing staff turnover, improving market size, or meeting social responsibilities rather than moral incitement. Public policy has dealt with community relations as a problem out there, rather than the problem which the policy-making apparatus reflects and shapes. There is an overwhelming tendency to react to the community relations issues rather than develop proactive strategies. And that was as a result of a pretty detailed research into who was doing what in terms of tackling antagonism in this society. And I think one of the issues there is that in continually dealing with community relations as a matter of individual relationships as a question of social relationships which need to be addressed and in which public policy has a critical role, effectively you end up with a short-circuiting conversation all the time in which people are able to run away from the comprehensive nature of what's going to have to occur here. So we now see this huge scale and scope change from £3,500 grants to what is a mini Marshall Plan. That is what Delors understands it to be. A Marshall Plan based on the notion of reconstruction after conflict, which was what was done to Germany after 1945. And so the transfer of resources to reconstruct. It is talking not just about, it expands the notion of community relations, or certainly reconciliation, from simply being a question of interpersonal discussion to being a question of economic and social regeneration and engagement of that class. It develops partnerships, and it mainstreams the notion that all of this has to do with reconciliation, although it does so without really defining terms. So, you have an expanding agenda very quickly. From 4 years into the Community Relations Council, you have peace as a comprehensive activity, reconciliation, intercommunity relationships as the ideology of peace building, actually, from the international community, and from the governments that they're pushing straight across all of this. And peace sponsored from abroad. Part of the issue, of course, here is that of the buy-in of people here who are part of this process and participating in it, recipients of resource, but the question to which they're driving the agenda is now becoming a serious and significant question. To what degree do we simply receive this as money and turn it into what we want to do, and to what degree do we engage with the purpose of the change that's underlying? But within 3 years you get to the Good Friday Agreement, which brings constitutional and political reform. You've got Section 75, you've got absolutely loads of project and pilot-based activities, but no serious institutional reform in Northern Ireland, except with one exception, Patton, of the police, which emerged so what you have now is that justice is differently conceived from the rest of the society. Justice is not dehaunted. Police is fully and totally 50-50 across the board, or has been, and no other agency had to go through any of that. All the other agencies remain effectively questions of trying to create stasis. And the question is that there's an underlying tension emerging between this whole process of reconciliation, between a kind of international, articulated, locally driven notion this is about the vision of the future, to a more real political concept, which is simply this is about what is required for stability and containment. And actually I think that is still the debate that goes on about what it is we're trying to do here. Are we simply trying to create stability and containment, or is there a vision to move past the underpinning structural questions that are there? And I think that remains a very deep problem, or are they really alternatives? Bluntly, just to show you the sheer scale of what we're talking about here, who paid for peace? The European peace programmes over the years have put £1.455.5 million into Northern Ireland. The IFI, 628, that might be up to 74 now, somebody said to me today. CCRU, the government, 134, so a tenth of what was put in by the European Union. DEMI, 66 million. Northern Ireland Office for Victims, which is a very interesting phenomenon because it only started in 1998, has already overtaken that. The Irish government put in 30 million, and AP, it's very difficult to assess because it's under different headings, but roughly speaking 90 million over the year, one single individual donor. But one individual donor here has given more than the Department of Education to this. And in percentage terms, this is, the European Union paid for 61% of what counted as investment in peace programme. The International Fund for Ireland gave 26%. AP for Irish government 1. So if you take all of that out, and it's not quite right because you'll see what I do, because the EU peace programme has a subvention from the United Kingdom government as well within it. But the programmes which are internationally agreed are actually close to, I think it's 92% of this money. And as we come to the end of this, the question is absolutely clear, is what remains of this and the transfer of this knowledge into the locally contained knowledge and driving of local communities. And what do they pay for? There's a huge discussion around the community relations industry, the peace building industry. And of course, in what is narrowly called community relations, i.e. that inter-community, you can identify about 300 jobs. But to be very clear, piece 1 was overwhelmingly about employment, urban and rural generation, cross-border, social inclusion was 23%, industrial development and partnerships, and the inter-community element of that was 2%. It is simply not true that small group work or dialogue was the focus of peace process management. It's absolutely not true. And piece 2 was exactly the same. Economic regeneration 31, social inclusion 23, local partnerships 17, outward and forward looking 5, cross-border 15, and technical assistance 9. All that's publicly available. But there's an extremely distortionary discussion going out there, which is that everybody was focused into doing forced inter-community work, to be honest with you. What actually happened was there was a mass regeneration programme at every level, which was economic and social, in which far more money went to the Strabane bypass and on painting buses than did go on the notion of creating inter-community dialogue possibilities. So to be very clear about it, there is a misunderstanding of the way community relations activity as an activity fits into this. It fits into this peace building strategy only as part of it. And if you look at the issues which people pay for, with the exception of victims' money, reconciliation is the core theme which every funder supported. Reconciliation as, these are all the different funders, what did they say, for what? The economic development was core in the European programmes. The inter-community contact element was there, which is why people suggest that it's the kind of core dominant ethos. And human rights was a priority, an explicit priority only of Atlantic, actually. It was left, the way in which human rights interacted with these things, to be honest with you, none of the other funders explicitly refer to it. So that's I think that's a significant point. Just finally, Peace by Paymaster, if you take the UK Treasury grant, block grant for Northern Ireland, 29% of the money that takes in the European money donation they make. The European Union pays 50% of it. The US government paid 11% of it. So it leaves us extremely vulnerable if what it does not achieve is some kind of social change, and simply leaves change at the level of pilot projects, and that there's nothing in behavioural and structural change which happens. And it effectively, this is another quote which is far too long, and I'm sorry it's far too long. Are you still alive, Duncan? Throughout our study, there were a number of references made to hard and soft work with regard to community relations. Community relations is nearly always perceived of as soft, largely because it is considered more fluid and difficult to grasp, associated with relationship building and feelings, rather than with the subjects and objects of policy. In contrast, equality is regarded as hard, but it has measurable outputs for hard-headed business and management. This language enables government, business and policymakers to ignore the relational consequences of equity, which are nowhere considered, and more crucially, the actually hard issues. These hard areas in community relations include changes in structures and practices which involve management dealing with the impact of fear and threat and the creation of jointly owned institutions. Without a commitment to confront the hardness of the implications of comprehensive community relations policy, the subject will always be demoted, marginalised and ridiculed by those threatened by its implications. Our local studies confirm the largely unchallenged willingness of public bodies to deliver equitable services along traditional utilitarian lines. This inevitably results in the embedding of these divisions in a modern institutional form. The reason I put that up is effectively to say that the escape of community relations into the policy-making environment and into the mainstreaming environment now becomes the really critical issue. And what is interesting is the degree to which it constantly gets driven back into the soft and into the question of dealing with relationships at a lower level. Section 75 did come in, and it created a very interesting combination of duties, which has paradoxically led to a massive row about whether this exists at all and what it means. In other words, it's secondary, it's equal, or if it's secondary, how secondary is it to this? At what point does it kick in? What does regard mean? What this group did was get a schedule, Schedule 9 as to what you had to do within the Act. There's no schedule attached at all to this part, so nobody knows what it means and what you do. And one of the paradoxes of it is it raises it to an obligation. Definitely it's in law, it says you have to do something about this, but exactly what you have to do and what its relationship is to the rest of the Act, nobody seems to be clear what's at all. And so we end up with the worst of all possible worlds, which is we pay lip service to it, but nobody actually knows in the slightest what it actually means that you have to do. What actually happened in the Community Relations Council was, and across Community Relations, was a strong trend away from small group activity into mainstreaming. And you can see it all over the place. Getting off the fence, doing business in divided society, getting off the fence, that was with the social workers, with the students, with the colleges. The Creating Common Ground Consortium brought the Housing Executive around the table, also consider healing through remembering the issues of the past, early years initiatives, working with churches on an institutional basis, Diversity 21, working through DCAL, working with policing, working with district councils and community fora, the parades mediation, voluntary organisation, early years, the list is endless. Effectively, there's no doubt whatsoever though that community relations work by 2001 is nothing like what it looked like in 1990. Nothing like what it did. Furthermore, the reach and scope achieved by Piece 1, where it's got to, into places like Mullaban, it's into Largs and Donaghcloney, it's towards Phelan and Bubble, it's in Gaylearn. There's a Training and Learning Consortium. There are grants going to the Community Relations Council in 2001 are going to Bloody Sunday Trust, Pat Finucane Centre, Highfield History and Politics Group and the Apprentice Boys. The notion that this is simply middle class people getting small grants to talk about nothing is no longer viable from the latest 2000. But the really big question is, how are we going to get this into systemic change? Can this be raised from mainstreaming in organisations to a question of systemic change? The Good Friday Agreement, apparently, in its second paragraph, put reconciliation at the core. It said, we must never forget, that's the second paragraph, those who have died or been injured and their families, but we can best honour them through a fresh start, in which we firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance and mutual trust, and to the protection and vindications of human rights of all. So the very big question is, what does that mean in practical terms? Because theoretically that puts you into the mainstream. In 2003, Brandon Hamber and Gráinne Kelly published what they considered, after some qualitative research around talking to a lot of people, of what they thought the core elements of reconciliation actually meant now in this society. Where had community relations got to? They said, this is what it's going to look like. A shared vision of an interdependent society, acknowledgement of dealing with the past, building positive relationships across divides, significant cultural and attitudinal change, and equity, social, economic and political change, having to deal with all those social and economic issues. Now, as put by them, they said these are all things around a round table which have to be interactively dealt with in a complex interaction. But what was clear by then in 2003 is there was actually a fairly clear ideology operating through the core of the peace process, which was clear. This is the direction we needed to go in towards all of these things. And it was immediately adopted into the peace programme. And at the same time, just so you know, all of this was promised as government action by this stage. 2001, they said in the programme for government. By 2003, review and put in place a cross-departmental strategy for the promotion of community relations, leading to measurable improvements in community relations. 2002, the Harkison Review. This review believes that acceptance and or support for either separate development or coexistence is inherently unstable, undesirable, inefficient, and not an outcome implied or desired by the programme for government. The review team concluded that policy should commit to an overarching goal of a cohesive but pluralist society. Underpinning such a view of Northern Ireland are the three principles of equity, diversity and interdependence, which should encapsulate government's commitment to promoting better relations. And then in 2005, while government wants to support activities that build confidence within and between communities, approaches that reinforce segregation must be challenged. In this respect, all community development programmes should be required to identify how they will address sectarian and or racist behaviour to enable communities to work more effectively together and identify the expected good relations outcomes of their work. The point I'm trying to get to here is But what you can see in community relations and its progress to this stage is that it has moved way beyond the notion of small-scale intervention, past the notion of mainstreaming, into a comprehensive notion which is starting to define, actually, a whole lot of things around the nature of where the future is going, and seems apparently to be based on increasing level of seniority. What is absolutely clear also, however, is that the buy-in to this and the context within which it was happening remained extremely, extremely vulnerable. So, you have a huge development into policy development that you can really start to see. It is not true. There is a good relations panel, there's good North Belfast Action Group, there's a community action group, there's re-imaging, there's shared education project, there's shared neighbourhoods, there's the interface working group, centenary celebrations, there's the Ashdown Parades Review, there's the Gerby Crumlin Road Advisory Group, there's Beyond Belfast, the interface in rural areas, there's EU Learning from Peace programmes, there are research programmes, there are international peace programmes, which are all now dominated and decided against criteria which are essentially reconciliation criteria which have been read across from Hammer and Kelly. And in effect, you start to see the distribution of grants to groups. It's not about a golden circle either. There are 147 groups getting major awards from the Community Relations Council, of whom 104 were different. But this is the pattern we're starting to see. Loads of pilot activity, loads of think tank activity, loads of small-scale mainstreaming, loads of promising promise around politics, but actually no institutional change, and actually what emerges is eventually a serious gap. Start looking at who got funded. I'm not even going to go there. The nature of who the clients are, this is the interface funding that I picked up from the Community Relations Council over the period 2002 to the present day, about who actually gets the money. It has absolutely nothing to do with blue rinses. It has everything to do with people sitting in interfaces now working directly at the core. If you want to look at, you can take a look at the groups yourself, but the incredible investment now in actually creating interface, cross-interface discussions and groups. So what community relations is, what people think it is radically altering. And this just tells you the nature of the small grant. So, and I will actually come to an end here, you'll be glad to know. The issue of who is engaged in community relations work. The evidence in 1990 is that there was a narrow band of activists, local historical societies, reconciliation groups, activists. By 2011, there was an extremely wide range of grant recipients in every district council. The active engagement of district councils, international funding programmes, sporting bodies, housing activists, government departments, victims, survivors, ex-prisoners, language activists, museums, security forces, schools, youth organisations, community leaders, volunteer organisations and churches. And the question I suppose I'm asking as an academic is, we need to stop talking about it now as a non-sophisticated model of practice of small numbers of people. There's more pilots than Ryanair. No, none around here. The scale of the engagement was previously around community level action, residential work, adult and community education, youth work, conferences, publications and media, and a small amount of intervention. By 2011, you're dealing with the past. You have shared space as a concept that everybody's working on. You have interface work directly. You have cultural contention.